Welcome to week 3. So far in this course we've been focusing on learning, and this week we turn our attention to teaching. And the question for this week is, what makes a good teacher? As you will have noticed, the pattern of learning on this course is that we've been inviting key speakers to come along to talk to us about their research in those particular areas. And this week we have Professor Alex Moore, who's one of my colleagues at the Institute of Education, who's done so much work in this area. He's actually written a book called The Good Teacher. And so Alex is going to share with us some of his thoughts around this topic this week. And we'll start off with the obvious question, Alex, is what is a good teacher?
Yes, a very difficult question actually, and one which I kind of try and resist answering. In fact, every time I talk about the book, I have to begin by saying I'm not going to tell you how to be a good teacher. And I've got several reasons for resisting this notion of identifying the good teacher. I mean, for one thing, I think it oversimplifies what's a very complex set of issues. It seems to suggest that there is some kind of archetypal good teacher that we can all become. Deborah Britzman once said, in fact a long time ago now, that learning to teach, like teaching itself, is an ongoing, endless process of becoming. And she contrasts becoming to being. And I take this kind of idea very seriously, and I think perhaps what we need to do, rather than trying to identify the good teacher, which is about who I am or what I am, that we focus more on what I might become. So really we're focusing more on each person looking at their teaching, analysing their teaching. Am I happy with it? How do I make it better? So we're constantly trying to improve what we're doing, rather than aiming to be something that, well, actually we may never be, and we may be permanently disappointed that we're not being. So I'm inclined to focus much more, I think, on good teaching rather than good teacher. I mean, of course, you can identify some fairly obvious things that if you're pushed to say what a good teacher is. Of course, a teacher needs to be able to plan lessons appropriately and carefully and thoroughly. A good teacher needs to be able to communicate well with their students, to be sympathetic to students' needs, to recognise, the different interests and ways of learning that students might have in a big classroom, to have a good knowledge of their subject area and so forth. And these things are often listed as attributes that a good teacher must have. I think they're fairly obvious actually, and there may be some other perhaps less obvious qualities, or not less obvious but less visible in public policy qualities that a teacher might have. For example, I think if we believe that a teacher should be focused on becoming rather than being, the teacher needs to be adaptable, flexible. And I think something else that's often quite missing from the sort of public versions of what a good teacher is I've always believed that a teacher needs to recognise that they're not working alone. It's very easy, I think, for teachers to become isolated within their classrooms and also with their problems. And I think that's increasingly the case now, unfortunately. I remember years ago, if I had a problem, I would feel quite happy to go to my head of department or even the head teacher or deputy head and say, look, I'm having a problem, I'm worried, I'm unhappy about something. Whether I would do that now, I'm not sure. I think unfortunately we live in a situation now in schools in which people, are, if anything, becoming more isolated from one another, more concerned about their own career opportunities and the potential impact of sharing a problem with colleagues. And so the idea of collaboration, I think, of working as a team, to me that's a very important characteristic of being a good teacher, if I have to identify a good teacher, rather than some of the more simplistic kind of views that we sometimes get in sort of public policy documentation. And really, I think partly this is about also teachers recognising what Ivor Goodson called the messy complexity of the classroom. Identifying a good teacher to me is a bit like, I think it's characteristic of a general trend in education, of trying to kind of resist difference, to try and find uniformity and conformity. We have, to try and come up with a national curriculum that everybody does. It's very prescriptive, to come up with standard attainment tests for young people. And then you have sort of Ofsted criteria and so on. And to me, all of these movements, along with this idea of identifying a good teacher, they really take attention away from the sort of what I've called the idiosyncratic and contingent aspects of teaching and classroom experience. A good what is a good teacher? Good teaching. Things that you do well and that work in one situation, for example, may not work in another. Things that work in one school may not work in another school. So your teaching may be different according to the circumstances you're working in, the students you're working with. But it doesn't mean that one version is better than the other one, or one is good and one isn't. So I'm kind of resistant to these efforts to identify a good teacher, and perhaps just to say there is good teaching, and each one of us is responsible in the end for making our teaching better, rather than trying to reach some kind of stage where we can put a full stop at the end of the sentence and say, well, I'm now a good teacher. So the idea can also breed a certain complacency, I think. It can actually work against the idea of ongoing professional development, career development. And in a way, I don't think this is helped by, the idea of now that, in many countries now, of moving through different stages. And in each one, you're identified as a particular kind of teacher. A beginning teacher, moving through expert teacher and so on. I'm not sure that these are very helpful, really. Because they, as I say, they kind of take away or they kind of undermine, I think, the responsibility that we all have and the desire we all have to constantly be evaluating our own teaching and to try and improve it as much as we can, and to never stop doing that, really.